Spanish was once the language of education, of the courts, of politics, and of literature in the Philippines. But today, it's nearly vanished. Some say it's because actually Spanish was never really taught to Filipinos in an attempt to keep us controlled and ignorant. Others say, including notoriously flawed BBC production about Spanish in the Philippines, only the elite spoke Spanish, nobody else did, so that English quickly supplanted Spanish when the Americans arrived. But what was the reality? Did you know that Spanish actually peaked in the Philippines during the American period and not right after Spain left? So what happened afterwards? This is a story of language suppression, of the clash of ideological and colonial narratives, and of the devastating effects of World War II, the perfect storm that pushed Spanish off the cliff. Let's uncover the surprising truth together. You might assume Spanish started dying out in 1898 when Spain left, but that's not true. In fact, the Spanish language in the Philippines experienced a golden age during the American colonial period, with newspapers and literature flourishing despite the rising influence of English. Even in 1960, American political advisor Henry Jones Ford wrote about the continued rise of Spanish speakers despite the US pushing English, as we showed in our previous video. He said that there were 40 or so newspapers, none of them in English, with the usual newspapers written in Spanish and the local language, be that Ilocano or Tagalog or Bisaya, etc. So what happened? Well, the US did push English, especially through the public school system starting in 1901, but it took time. By 1916, Henry Jones Ford was saying that the experiment was a failure as people kept on using Spanish despite the best efforts by the Americans. He said that it was because English was used only in public schools, while Spanish was still used extensively outside of school, especially at home. Additionally, the private schools continued to teach Spanish and were bastions of the elite, who had reasons to look down on the Americans and English as a foreign influence, the Spanish language having been already internalized as Filipino. Over time, however, the shift became clear. By the 1930s and 40s, English had replaced Spanish among most of the educated, non-elite population. Even the private universities were eventually forced to shift to English, as mentioned by Florentino Rodao in his article Spanish Language in the Philippines 1900 to 1940.
Spanish language during the American period. The policy implemented by the United States instituting the English language as the primary language to be used as a medium of instruction was a long-range policy to bolster the annual increase of the number of English-speaking persons in the Philippines. However, in spite of this, the Spanish language maintained its resilient hold on the educational system. This was because many religious educational institutions characteristic of the educational system during the American period, particularly those administered by religious orders, persisted in teaching in Spanish, therefore maintaining a considerable number of young Spanish-speaking Filipinos. After World War I, the American authorities started to press more and more for these private schools to teach in English. And, as Frederick Fox noted, toward the end of the American administration, the use of English, particularly at the primary grade level, grew increasingly controversial. The Catholic universities, pressed by the gradually changing society or by the colonial authorities, also followed suit and shifted to the language of the colonial master. First it started with the Ateneo de Manila and finally even with the supposed stronghold of the Spanish in Manila, the University of Santo Tomas.
Still, many of the elite, especially the land-owning and political families, remained bilingual in Spanish and English. So let's try to go back in time to 1916, when most everybody who was educated spoke Spanish, and it was not just the elites. Meaning, to be educated meant one spoke Spanish. Please note the distinction we're making here. The educated versus the elite, los educados versus los ilustrados or los élites. Both spoke Spanish, and both were educated, but the ilustrados were a subset of the educados and likely had higher education and were the elites of society versus the rest of the educados. So Spanish was even gaining more ground despite the fact that the public school system was already forcing the issue of teaching English. Spanish was seen as part of the Filipino heritage, its use a defiance against the English language being posed by new colonial masters. But after World War I, the Americans redoubled their efforts and pressure, with the result that even the Catholic schools were forced to teach in English, and that it was not just the public school system anymore where English was king. By the 1930s, English clearly had enough time to gestate and take root that as a result, graduates of the public school system presumably preferred English even while the elite preferred Spanish, even though they spoke English as well. At this point, we can now see a possible point of duality, where the educated class, including the elites, now spoke presumably in English, as English replaced Spanish in the school system. But the elites educated in Catholic schools and universities still spoke Spanish aside from English. Now, remember the distinction we made a while ago? Whereas before, the educated spoke Spanish, whether common people or the elites or ilustrados, now it's possible that those educated through the public school system preferred English, while those educated in the Catholic universities, the elites, preferred Spanish. Could this be the reason why nowadays people think that only the elite spoke Spanish, even though during the early American period, educated people, both common people and the elites, spoke Spanish? Well, statistically, it's hard to prove one way or the other, given the fact that, number one, Henry Jones Ford had written in 1916 that the reports that said English was rapidly growing were fallacious, as his lived experience showed the opposite in his travels throughout the Philippines. Clearly, there were strong political incentives to show that the English language policy of the US was working even when it was not. So it's hard to believe the self-serving reports being dished out by the colonial administrators that Spanish was being quickly replaced by English. Number two, Florentino Rodao is also quite skeptical of the reports at the time. For example, he writes about the issues with the census results, and he writes,
But questions still remained unanswered. How accurate was the census then? Did it give a fair picture of the existing situation? Was there a lot of Spanish-speaking people, or only a few? It seems that there was no chance to indicate in the census being able to speak more than one foreign language. In the chart of persons able to speak foreign languages, the figures for each language are merely added to point out that 4,831,465 persons, 1 in every 3 persons, spoke a language of foreign origin, thereby ignoring those able to speak 2 or more of those languages. We can only surmise that the reason for these apparent mistakes was that those who filled out the census forms could choose only one foreign language able to speak. Therefore, there was probably no accurate estimate of the number of Spanish-speaking or German or French-speaking persons in the Philippines. These persons would have been diminished in the total number of the persons who knew the language but spoke English better. In the same manner, those Spanish, German, French, or Chinese speakers surely would be able to speak English also.
Remember that educated Filipinos were generally at least bilingual. So if you only had one language to choose from, you could indicate perhaps one or the other, and it's not clear if you could have answered both, according to Rodao. Additionally, we have to remember that Henry Jones Ford had written that Filipinos were largely written off as illiterate if they neither spoke Spanish or English, even though they could read and write in their own native languages. So isn't it easier to presume Filipinos had some knowledge of Spanish, even if they answered English in the census? Especially if they spoke Spanish at home. Rodao writes further.
Going back again to the data shown by the census, we see also that the base of Spanish speakers was more solid than that of the English speakers, which was concentrated almost exclusively between the ages of 10 and 54. The sharp decline in their use of Spanish shows that more people born before 1898 use it, but less than 1% of children under 5 years old who spoke English used it. This shows that English was learned in the schools, not at home. And there is another important fact which must be noted here, although English speakers surpassed Spanish speakers by more than 10 times. From 1,259,549 to 417,375, the census shows that the only age group with more Spanish speakers was not among the older people, but that of under 5 years old, from 10,000 to 14,000. This fact was also clearly pointed out in the census. It thus affirmed that Spanish has still a more stable base than English, particularly if the teaching of English at the schools is discontinued. Spanish is still a more widely used language than English at home. Census 1939, 330.
Japanese occupation and language suppression. Then came World War II and the Japanese occupation. The Japanese banned Spanish and promoted Nihongo and Tagalog, but English was tolerated. They even tried to remove Spanish from the legal system, until Madrid was said to have intervened diplomatically, and Spanish was apparently reinstated in the courts. By the time of liberation in 1945, the Japanese imperial forces made a desperate last stand in the old city of Manila, committing war atrocities and murdering thousands of civilians, including German brothers of De La Salle at Taft Avenue, for example. And they decimated the Spanish citizens and Filipino speakers of Spanish in the old city, even though theoretically, Germans were allied with the Japanese and Spanish citizens were neutral. Additionally, the massive bombing campaign of the Americans resulted in the near total destruction of Manila, second only perhaps the destruction of Warsaw and Poland. Because of the war against Japan, Filipinos in general sided with the Americans, treating them as liberators from Japanese occupation, which was considered cruel and oppressive. This led to a more rapid Americanization of Filipino culture, with each cry of "Victory, Joe!" English became the symbol of progress and freedom. Spanish, on the other hand, was relegated to the background. The destruction of Manila had also destroyed the cultural center of the Spanish language in the Philippines, with many Spanish citizens who survived going back to Spain after the war. While Spanish didn't really suddenly disappear, it was now virtually stunted by ensuing developments. It was only a matter of time that it would decline given the ascendancy of English. Now, what was the economic impact of the war? That's up next.
Economic impact of the war. World War II set back the Philippine economy severely, with its GDP falling by about 70% by the end of the war in 1945 compared to 1940 levels. This massive economic decline was caused by multiple factors. Japanese occupation policies. The Japanese military administration controlled the economy by closing Western banks, issuing their own fiat currency, known as Mickey Mouse money, and disrupting established industries like sugar production. These actions caused hyperinflation, with prices, for example, rice in Manila increasing by over 137,000% between 1942 and 1945. Destruction of infrastructure and capital. The war, especially the Battle of Manila, resulted in widespread destruction of infrastructure, capital assets, agricultural terraces, and urban centers. The deliberate scorched earth tactics by retreating Japanese forces further devastated the economy. Disruption of trade and supply chains. The occupation and war severed the Philippines' pre-war trade relationships, leading to shortages of food and fuel and collapsing supply chains. This caused widespread unemployment and food scarcity. Human losses and social impact. Approximately 1 million Filipinos died during the war years, further impacting the labor force and social structure. Post-war recovery challenges. By the war's end, total economic output was estimated to be only about 30% of pre-war levels. Recovery began with the restoration of infrastructure by U.S. military engineers and international relief efforts, but the economic damage left a long-lasting legacy of poverty and underdevelopment.
In summary, World War II caused an estimated 70% reduction in Philippine GDP, widespread inflation, destruction of capital and infrastructure, and severe social disruptions, setting back the country's economy by decades and making post-war rehabilitation a monumental challenge. This is an important point to make since post-World War II, these realities appear to have been swept aside, replaced by bitter and acrimonious debates over why the Philippines was economically backward, specifically the clear anti-colonialist blame game that arose after independence. Rodao writes regarding Spanish in the Philippines post-war.
Post-war Philippines. The most substantive change, however, was within Filipino society. The wave of pro-Americanism destroyed all kinds of balance among the Filipinos between their Spanish, English, and local identities. After the war, this role of the United States magnified tremendously. The Filipinos became more patriotic than the Americans themselves. In this context, the role of the Spanish language was put in a corner. The former role of Spanish or Hispanism as the balance for Filipinism had no place any longer in Filipino society.
Rodao concludes,
Two roles in the Filipino society were left for the Spanish language. One in society life, delving in chismes, and second, the prestige of being part of the upper class. This elitist sense or meaning could serve one purpose, but at the same time, could serve the opposite. This is what happened. The identification of Spanish with the oligarchy in the Philippines symbolized the identification of all things Spanish with the rising societal problems in Filipino society. Of course, this fact has affected would-be Spanish speakers or people able to understand Spanish, but has made them, in some way, not proud of this unique ability. Notably, there were no new Spanish speakers after the war.
Anti-colonialism and the vilification of Spanish. Also after World War II, a new wave of anti-colonial nationalism rose, driven by Marxist and leftist-leaning writers like Renato Constantino. Spanish was condemned as the language of the friars, the landlords, and colonial oppression. But here's the strange part. This harsh critic wasn't applied to English or even to Nihongo, Japan's wartime language, but appeared to be particularly focused on the Spanish language and anything Spanish. On the Marxist take on the Spanish influence.
Renato Constantino, a prominent Filipino nationalist historian known for his Marxist-influenced critique of Philippine history, had analyzed Spanish colonialism as a system of exploitation and cultural domination. Although he did not explicitly label himself a Marxist, his framework reflected Marxist ideas. Constantino argued that Spanish colonialism imposed a colonial mentality that devalued native culture and language, including the Spanish language as a tool of colonial hegemony. He emphasized that the Spanish colonial regime maintained power through ideological control, including language policies that kept the majority of Filipinos marginalized and excluded from political power. However, even just a casual inspection of the anti-Spanish sentiment of Marxist historians like Constantino already points out glaring facts that the simplistic reductionism to class struggle overlook. 1. Spain wasn't generally making money from its colonial enterprise in the Philippines, but stayed nevertheless as evangelization was a serious goal of the Spanish crown. Of course, this does not make sense to Marxists who believe that religion is the opium of the people, something that a colonial power uses to dull people to submission while it exploits the country. With this in mind, to them, Spain must be clearly guilty of oppression just by pushing Catholicism, right? But Spain was bleeding its treasury in providing subsidies for the Philippines even while evangelizing, so this Marxist reductionism does not hold water at all. 2. Additionally, Spain built schools and universities, political institutions, and introduced a secular public school system precisely to benefit Filipinos starting in 1863, while previous to that, the friars did their best to learn and document, and thus preserve, the native languages. So again, which part of this narrative exactly was devaluing to native culture and language, according to Marxist reductionism?
There were efforts to restore Spanish in the education system. However, given the zeitgeist after Philippine independence, these efforts were rejected and were in fact, in the end, very counterproductive. It even produced more negative sentiments against Spanish and the Spanish colonial presence, riding on the strong Marxist spirit of the times. Remember that at this point, Spanish had become the favorite bogeyman for all the ills of the country. Never mind the Japanese invasion severely set back the Philippine economy, especially Manila, which was bombed back to the Stone Age. And yet apparently, it's always Spain's fault if the Philippines was backward. So why the selective hate for Spanish that we don't find for Japan and Nihongo or the US in English? Some argue that it wasn't just about colonialism, it was about religion, which brings us back again to the very roots of the leyenda negra. Spanish was deeply tied to Catholicism, and many revolutionary leaders were Masons, anti-clerical in ideology. Additionally, Marxist ideology is militantly anti-Catholic, and the 20th century saw the rise of communist governments that executed thousands of priests and religious in an effort to stamp out religion. So there must be something to it, that to reject Spanish was to symbolically reject the Catholic Church, and not just the colonizer. Okay, so we think we're ready to go back to the ultimate question. So why don't Filipinos speak Spanish anymore? Here are our views. First, because the educated class eventually shifted from Spanish to English within 1 or 2 generations into the American regime, given the economic advantages that accrued to an ability to speak English during the American regime. By itself, though, it should mean that the educated class could still be bilingual in English and Spanish, and this did not necessarily mean the end of Spanish use by Filipinos. as indeed was the case of many Filipino households that were bilingual or trilingual, where they spoke Spanish, English, and a local language in the household. The second point was more pivotal. World War II proved catastrophic. The near total destruction of Manila destroyed the Spanish-speaking hub of the country, leading to the mass migration out of the country of Spanish speakers and thus collapsing the cultural center of the Spanish language in the Philippines. The strong anti-Japanese sentiment meant that Filipino culture became highly Americanized during liberation, becoming even more Americans than the Americans, and English became the new status symbol of power and prestige, no longer Spanish. Spanish was no longer seen as a language of opposition to America except by the Hispanistas, who were looked down upon as old-fashioned and behind the times as English became accepted culturally by Filipinos. Third, the rise of militant Marxism and the communist movements after World War II fueled the rise of strong anti-colonial narratives, and in the Philippines, this was especially focused against Spanish, which was framed as the language of oppression embedded with a deep anti-Catholic bias in Marxist historiography. Finally, in homes that still maintained Spanish, Spanish was still spoken in successive generations regardless of economic class, but this group became marginalized in society and would prefer speaking in English or the vernacular in public rather than in Spanish out of fear of being maligned or mocked. The exception was the mestizo class that still spoke Spanish among themselves publicly, who were grudgingly accepted but who were still derided as well as coño people. This gave the illusion of the disappearance of Spanish except by the mestizo class, although in reality, Spanish was still used, but it was hidden, and yes, it was already in decline nonetheless. This likely gave rise to the idea that only the elite spoke Spanish, something not true at all, but believed as true by the general population. So in the end, Spanish in the Philippines didn't decline for any one cause, but because of a perfect storm post-Philippine independence. And ultimately, it declined because it became socially unacceptable to be used except by stereotypes who were expected to speak it. Nowadays, there's renewed interest in learning Spanish by young people who are not burdened by the anti-Spanish bias of old. However, the social stigma is still there, especially in social media, despite the fact that Filipinos who virtually signal their anti-colonial sentiment by expressing disgust over seeing Spanish in the social platforms don't seem to see the hypocrisy of using another colonial imposition, English, when expressing these anti-colonial views against the Spanish language. The cognitive dissonance can perhaps be explained away by saying that English has been culturally accepted as part of being Filipino, so there's no apparent conflict. It is for this reason, perhaps, it's time as well to think of Spanish as something Filipino as well, in the same way that the English language is treated. It's for this reason that we think Spanish should be treated as a Filipino heritage language, as we have been constantly pushing here in the Los Filipinos YouTube channel. So what do you think? Should Filipinos bring Spanish back into the conversation about our past? In the meantime, hit that like button and subscribe to continue supporting our channel. Viva Los Filipinos! Mabuhay!